The United States is a country in crisis tonight. For an 8th straight day, Americans took to the streets from New York City to St. Paul, Minnesota, to Houston, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. For the most part, they appeared peaceful, people not willing to remain silent and risk being complicit. With nighttime curfews approaching, though, in many cities, the threat of more violence looms after President Donald Trump threatened to deploy the military if cities and states fail to stop the protests. Good evening and thanks for joining us. The United States of America appears deeply divided tonight. Fed up with police brutality and systemic racial inequality, protesters are demanding accountability, a commitment to change and leadership that will deliver it. President Trump isn't reaching out to try to bridge that divide. He is deepening it. Today, his rival, Joe Biden, in his first public address since the pandemic put his campaign on pause, warned Americans not to let rage consume them.
Donald Trump has turned this country into a battlefield riven by old resentments and fresh fears. He thinks division helps him. Ask every American, look at where we are now and think anew. Is this who we are? Is this who we want to be? Is this what we want to pass on to our children and our grandchildren? Fear, anger, finger pointing? The country is crying out for leadership. Leadership that can recognize pain and deep grief of communities that have had a knee on their neck for a long time.
There have been calls for President Trump to address the nation and appeal for calm. He hasn't done that. He has said the biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in the poorest communities, and he will fight to keep them safe. He's threatened to deploy federal troops to do it. Global's Jackson Proskow is near the White House tonight. Jackson, what's the situation like there now?
Donna, there are thousands of peaceful protesters in the street outside the White House, but for the first time tonight, they are separated from police by a 3-meter-high fence, which was installed after yesterday's chaos. Here and at locations across Washington, people have taken to the streets in defiance of a local curfew, and despite the fact that the military is now patrolling the streets.
In a preview of what might come to the rest of America, the U.S. military is now patrolling the streets of Washington on orders of the president. Army helicopters fly low, a tactic to scare away protesters.
I don't think that the military should be used on the streets of American cities against Americans. And I definitely don't think it should be done for a show.
The militarization of the U.S. Capitol comes as Donald Trump draws a line in the sand, opting for strongman tactics in a nation consumed by protest.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
The abrupt escalation came after federal officials moved in with force to disperse peaceful crowds outside the White House Monday.
Mr. President.
Moments later, the president walked through the freshly cleared streets to stage a photo op at the so-called Church of the Presidents, in a move meant to portray strength. Church leaders who were not told of the visit voiced objections.
And held up a Bible as if it were a prop or an extension of his military and authoritarian position, and stood in front of our building as if it were a backdrop for his agenda.
The White House has not shown any interest in hearing from protesters or dealing with concerns about systemic racism in America.
No justice, no peace.
With protests underway in more than 100 American cities, mayors and governors are now left to wonder how much longer they'll be able to balance the right to protest against the need to stop the looting and violence.
There is some welcome news from Minnesota tonight. That state has launched an investigation into the Minneapolis police force, a civil rights investigation looking at practices dating back more than a decade. And tonight, a lawyer for George Floyd's family says they expect that charges against the additional 3 officers involved in the case could be laid within a week. Donna?
All right, Jackson Proskow near the White House tonight. Thanks, Jackson. President Trump has told governors to act or he will mobilize federal troops, and he has the authority to do so under the Insurrection Act. Eric Sorensen explains what that is and how likely Trump is to use it.
When federal troops backed up police who cleared a path for the U.S. president, it was a signal from Donald Trump that he's willing to smash protests anywhere in the country.
That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America.
It would be unprecedented on such a scale, but not unheard of. The Insurrection Act, in part, empowers the president to call armed forces and the National Guard to protect constitutionally secured rights, typically at a request from a state governor. The act was last used during the Los Angeles riots in 1992 under President George H.W. Bush, and before that during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson to quell riots, including Detroit in 1967. In both cases, the president was asked for help
to initiate the movement of the troops which the governor had requested.
President Dwight Eisenhower once called in federal troops without a request to ensure black children could attend a formerly white school in Little Rock, Arkansas.
The cornerstone of our liberties was not observed in this instance.
And I don't think it should ever be used to enforce domestic law unilaterally against the will of a governor, particularly to move on peaceful protests. That is an entirely inappropriate use of Department of Defense resources.
The president wants to talk about just looting.
One state governor, Andrew Cuomo of New York, has said no thanks to federal troops. Other Democrats say the president's actions are unconstitutional.
I fear for the future of our country, that in this time of immense difficulty, our president is only capable of contributing more division, more fear, more chaos.
To stop the protests, Trump may be prepared to take on a constitutional challenge.
He sees it as a kind of political threat to his presidency. I think he's demonstrated that he's willing to test constitutional boundaries and see where the chips fall.
Preparing to call in the military has achieved one thing for President Trump. It has overshadowed news about the novel coronavirus on his watch. Eric Sorensen, Global News.